By the year 198 AD, China had descended into chaos, with open rebellion raging across the land for over a decade. This was a time when warriors could take power with the skill of their blade, and a single man could fight overwhelming odds and win. As such, warlords promoted by the former Han Emperor to crush the Yellow Turban Rebellion had refused to give up their power and now fought amongst themselves for supremacy. With pitched battles between the different power factions, infighting and betrayal setting the political stage, there was an opportunity for anyone with ambition to make a play for power and to alter history. From the mountain areas of northern China came two bandit queens, both hell-bent on ridding their lands of the old yoke and creating fame for themselves. Their arrival was prophesied by the renowned interpreter of dreams, Zhao Zhan, and his message was sent as a warning to the local lords. Our history would have the queens Zheng and Jiang die in 220 AD. Their names only mentioned in a single line of the Romance of the Three Kingdoms. But what if they had not died on that fateful day? What if they were to become more than just a footnote in history? It was upon a frosted morning in early spring that a warrior rode among the wooded landscape of China's northern mountains, headed towards the town of Taiyuan. This was Lady Zheng, the first bandit queen. She came from a harsh upbringing in the rice paddies of the empire's south, and it was here that she developed her hatred for the old regime and an iron will to see it destroyed. In the village where she lived, the local authorities were especially quick to use the back of their hands against the peasantry, and it was one such beating that changed Lady Zheng. Grabbing axes from the plantation's shed and no longer caring for the consequences, she hid herself and lay in wait for the perpetrators to pass by on their patrol. Still bloodied and bruised from the previous day, and with no formal training, her ambush was primal in nature, and unrelenting in her attack, she chased them, letting her rage fuel her strikes until they lay on the ground, lifeless and broken. With the deed done, she fled north through the countryside, a bandit on the run and an axe for hire. In her travels, she was to witness the same persecution across the empire, as the peasant classes bore the brunt of their rulers' whims. As she watched farms being burnt and their occupants butchered, she hardened her resolve and determination to end it. Looking at the devastation around her, as farm after farm lay in ruin, Lady Zheng took an oath to change the injustice that she had been witness to. Shrugging off the prejudice of others and holding a burning desire to lay waste to the old ways, she became a ferocious warrior. Using twin axes, she honed her fighting skills during her northern sojourn. She first made her mark when challenging the entire garrison of Taiyuan to a battle for the right to govern the town. The town's administrator was said to have laughed at the proposal. Intent to hang her broken body from the eaves of his office, he gathered his forces and met Lady Zheng on the battlefield. In the middle of the wooded countryside, Lady Zheng rode her valiant steed directly towards the enemies. As she came within range, they let loose volley after volley of arrows, but keeping her charger galloping towards the enemy lines, she was able to avoid being hit as the poorly trained garrison couldn't counter the speed at which she closed on them. As was her nature, she gambled her life on a simple tactic, used the speed, mass and maneuverability of her horse to overcome the enemy quickly, taking the chance that if she was able to get in among her enemy, their comrades would not fire into their fellow men. She was brutal in her attacks, ploughing through the enemy ranks and trampling them under hoof. She would strike with her axes only when the opportunity arose, and wheeling her horse around for several passes, her assault swiftly shattered the will of the first unit. She wasted no time switching her attention to the second, and kicking her heels into the flanks of her horse, she charged toward her new target. Using her horse's mass to trample anyone in her path, she followed up with swift strikes from her axes, showing herself to be a fearsome force. With little battle experience, half of their comrades dead or wounded on the ground, and their fellow unit running for the safety of the distant forest, Lady Zheng only had to make 2 passes against them before they also lost the will to fight. With both units of the garrison's troops routing, Lady Zheng now had breathing space to turn her attention to the enemy commander. Her foe was not as proficient in combat, but still managed to deflect a number of Lady Zheng's opening attacks. As she continued to chase him down, she wheeled one last time and lifting an axe to shoulder height, she sliced down across his back. Victory was hers. With the enemy commander now freed for the carrion, Lady Zheng turned her attention once again to the remaining troops who had rallied and steeled their nerves now that there was an open plain between them. Again she charged, and this time there would be no reprieve as she fought each of the units until their morale was broken and all but a few of the soldiers lay dead or dying at her feet, their blood draining into the soil, a symbol of what was to come. After cleaning the blood off her blades, she returned to Taiyuan, the head of the fallen administrator strapped to her side. Gathering the townsfolk in the centre square, she proclaimed that the town was now free from the rule of the Han and that she would take care of them. She painted a picture of freedom, unity and happiness, but to achieve this, they needed to rally to her banner and fight by her side. Some townsfolk were sceptical and fearful, arguing with Lady Zheng, but one that came forward was Lady Jiang. Coming from the town's middle class, she was the daughter of a local merchant. Lady Jiang's father had realised her intelligence at a young age and, throwing away their traditional values, educated her. When she heard Lady Zheng recount the day's battle and paint a picture of the future, she enlisted, driven by the ambition of the woman that had taken over her town and admiring the aura of power she possessed. Rather than focusing on a blade to change the world, Ji Young used her intelligence to train archers, discover how to build trebuchets, and research large-scale strategy. As the seasons passed, Lady Jiang and Zheng would become close. With one's intellect balancing the other's raw power, Jiang was eventually able to convince Zheng that they could rule together, each providing a strength to the other's weakness. In doing so, become the Bandit Queens. As the success of their victory over the Han spread among the northern provinces, locals started to flock to their cause, moving off the lands of their oppressive masters and into the arms of the Bandit Queens. Under Lady Jiang's guidance, the town of Taiyuan prospered, and using her business knowledge, it saw an increase in trade and prosperity. As the population began to swell, she put their new followers to work, constructing a wall around the capital and fields for grazing. During this time, she recruited members who showed the right temperament to perform special missions. It was here that she started to build a network of spies, and in the greys of dawn, she would send them off into the countryside to infiltrate and observe. As the leaves turned auburn, falling from the trees, and the cool winds of winter started to blow through the city streets, Lady Jiang turned her attention to their efforts for the following spring. Setting out a plan to expand, she recognised that they would need more food and raw materials to supply their new population and continue toward their goal. Thus, with the seasons changed, Zheng commanded their army, assaulting a local iron mine and nearby farmlands on the lush plains to the east. The mine's garrison was to provide stiff resistance, but was overcome by Lady Jiang's use of flaming arrows, while the farmland's defenders looked to protect their homesteads by valiantly advancing towards the invaders, but to little effect. As cavalry swept in from the flanks, the Han defenders fell without the Bandit Queen's front line ever seeing combat. And as rocks hurled by the trebuchets landed all around him, the sole survivor ran for his life. Realising that they will need friends and allies, their recent conquests held a secondary purpose from just feeding their people. It also made them noticed by the factions around them, and in the eyes of Lady Jiang, it was better to encourage those around them to initiate diplomacy rather than go openly seeking it. And among all the lords of the region, one person did take note. The Empire had always had a loose control of the north, and over the centuries, bandits and raiders roamed freely across its plains. One such bandit was Zhang Yan. Born under the name of Chu Yan, this infamous bandit leader was a charismatic individual who created his name when he merged his bandit gang with another, following a joint raid on the town of Yingdao. During the raid, his ally was to lose his life, dueling the town's champion at the height of the fighting. At the battle's conclusion, Chu Yan approached his counterpart's body and made a promise that his name would never be forgotten. As such, and in a sign of respect, he adopted his given name as part of his own to form Zhang Yan and combined the two gangs into one under his leadership. As time progressed, it was from a fortress deep within the Taihang Mountains he grew the Hessian bandits to be over 1 million strong and named himself the Mountain King, conducting raids across vast swaths of northern China with impunity as he chased his goal of fame and fortune. Seeing another opportunity to grow his numbers and the land that he ruled, the Mountain King sent a messenger to the Bandit Queens and proposed a meeting. The Mountain King's offer would see the queens become part of his advisors and hold some autonomy over their actions, but ultimately follow his rule. In this way, he offered prestige, wealth, and power, so long as they bend their knee and pay tribute for the privilege. The Bandit Queens considered Zhang Yan's offer, but turning to him, Lady Jiang replied, "Perhaps in time. For now, let us work on being friends and start with a simple act of trade." She proposed this as Lady Jiang saw that they were built on two fundamentally different principles. The Mountain King was driven by his own personal wealth and prosperity, while the Bandit Queens were driven by a grander purpose, one to change how the empire functioned and who held that power. By the end of the day, the two factions had agreed not to plunder from the other's land, and that the Bandit Queens would focus their efforts to the southeast, and the Mountain King would venture to the northeast and west of the mountains. Not content to sit idle and needing to refine the raw materials of their mine, the Bandit Queens assaulted a nearby settlement famed for its toolmaking. In Jiang's view, the best way to achieve minimal casualties and the greatest impact on reputation would be to swap traditional warfare on an open battlefield for a quick and decisive strike using stealth and guile. Thus it was under the veil of night that the Bandit Queens utilised a secret weapon, their elite soldiers of hidden axes. The men who made up this special unit were all ex-revolutionaries from the Yellow Turban Rebellion. The rebellion had been quelled a decade ago, however those who survived were all battle-hardened and still harboured hatred for the Han. Lady Zheng had specifically travelled to the surrounding villages and farms of Taiyuan in search of these men and enlisted them all. In doing this, she now had a group of soldiers who were dedicated to the cause and willing to do anything needed. They were trained in stealth and carried both a bow and axe to accomplish their missions. So it was that concealed a short distance from their objective, this elite unit waited for the signal to advance. Using the long grasses, underbrush and rocky outcroppings that covered the hillside the village was nestled among, the hidden axes had the perfect cover for their approach as they started their assault. Their mission was to capture towers on the outskirts of the settlement so that the main force could advance without opposition. Once the towers were in the hands of the Bandit Queens, Lady Jiang signalled for their trebuchet to fire upon a second set of towers to create a distraction and belief that this is where they would assault from. The garrison fell for the ruse and sent most of their forces toward the eastern gate, while the Bandit Queen's army made their way through the northern entrance that the hidden axes had secured. As the trebuchets fired, Lady Zheng and one of her commanders galloped through the gates held by their forces and commanded the hidden axes to fire at the garrison troops to keep them pinned so that she and her commander could close the gap to engage. Valiantly they rode forward, eager to press their attack. With all forces now committed, Lady Jiang ordered their artillery to change targets and fire upon the main garrison force. With this, boulders rained down upon the enemy forces, crushing all beneath them as they landed, sending shrapnel flying through the enemy ranks as they shattered. On the other side of the battlefield, the garrison captain sought to flank the attackers by moving his unit to higher ground. His advance stalled when he was confronted by the main bulk of the Bandit Queen's force, which quickly sought to block his path at a bottleneck. It was here that rows of archers stood behind a wall of infantry, ensuring that they could safely fire at their foe. As the captain realised his situation, he quickly ordered his unit to retreat, and, taking cover from the hail of arrows under their shields, they withdrew. It was not enough. The flaming arrows of the Bandit Queen's forces burnt the wooden shields and singed the flesh of their enemies until they finally broke, fleeing into the distance to save themselves. With the battle raging around the Bandit Queen commanders at full pitch, the Han forces who engaged them did not fare any better. Hopelessly overwhelmed by numbers and unable to counter the tactics of the Bandit Queens, the garrison fled. As the cries of the wounded fell silent, the echoes of battle faded away, the Bandit Queens celebrated their victory by raising a mug of ale to their fallen. Now that they had secured a heartland for their faction, they brought their thoughts to their continued conquest of China.